Well, hello everybody. This is Echoes of War. I'm joined here by my co-host Gaurav. How are you?
Hey Greg, wonderful to be here for another Echoes of War podcast, and let's continue down with our mini series.
For those who don't know, this is actually part three in a mini series covering the Malayan campaign of World War II. You don't necessarily have to watch previous episodes, but I think it certainly would help. But before we jump into it, I just want to say if you'd like to further support the channel, please check out our YouTube membership or our Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel, where you can get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And the latest episode behind that paywall is actually the first episode in a multi-part series, which is a alternate history of the Pacific War. The first episode is titled "The Great Naval Battle of Pearl Harbor." So if that's of interest to you, man, please go check it out. But stating all of that, I think we're jumping back into Malaya. And for those who aren't watching on YouTube, unfortunately, you're not going to get all the visuals. So I'm going to be tossing up a good old map of Malaya, excuse me. And we are about at this middle point. Actually, can you see the cursor, Gareth?
Can you just move it again? Yeah, now it's
Okay.
visible. It was kind of like intermittent a bit, but now it's there.
Yeah. So we're about this area right now. But obviously, I'm going to do a little bit of a summary of where we're at because it would be kind of ludicrous not to. So, to go all the way back, in December of 1941, Japan invaded British Malaya, aiming to cripple Allied power. Despite British defenses, General Yamashita, with his battle-hardened 25th Army, overwhelmed them quite easily. The British fumbled early, failing to strike Japanese beachheads, while the sinking of Fourth Sea left Malaya without any naval protection. At Jitra, the absence of tanks proved devastating for the Indian defenders. Yamashita employed blitzkrieg tactics, like using tanks and bicycles, to exploit the terrain. The British were spread very thin, they were under-resourced, and they were forced to retreat south, facing constant attacks and encirclements. The evacuation of Penang further demoralized the Allies, while locals turned against their colonial rulers. Despite acts of heroism, such as at Kampar, the Japanese advanced relentlessly. The defenders prepared a new line of defense at Trolak, about 5 miles north of Slim River. Reinforcements were arriving, such as the 45th Brigade, to repel the enemy's advance on Kuala Selangar. So if we look here at the map, you can see Kuala Kangsar, which is a different pronunciation of it, by the way. Tulak, Kampar, Slim River. This is about where we're going to be at today. Now, to catch up, General Paris is in control. And I know, Gaurav, you had said a little bit about Paris in the last episode, but perhaps you could just say a little bit more today.
So Paris is the exception of local level commanders in the campaign for the British forces. That he was one of the very few who trained his men and inspired them to fight. They were not panicking. So initially, when the 11th Indian Infantry Division was, like retreating because General Murray-Leon was kind of in a panic. The 12th Brigade of at that time Brigadier Archibald Paris was sent to provide rearguard protection for the retreating division. And they actually fought with such ferocity that the Japs were actually stunned, and their advance guards actually took quite a beating with quite high losses. And this was the example of what the British could actually have done even very early in the war if they just got away from the British army culture. I'll go a bit into the details when we talk about another officer,
I can think of who you're
but
talking about, yeah.
that was the reason the Japanese at least had some time to the 11th Indian Infantry Division had time to recover around the River is thanks to the defense provided by Brigadier Paris. And when Murray-Leon gets sacked quite early in the campaign, which was anyways is pretty much his last job in the army, for a while, Paris will now be in command of the division, but he will soon have to relinquish command to Major General Billy. key as and would revert back to commanding the 12th Brigade.
All right. And let me bring back up my beautiful map. Just put it over here. So that catches us up with the establishment of General Paris and how he's doing, as he's forming a new defensive line at the Slim River, approximately 50 miles north of Kuala Lumpur. The Slim River originated beyond Fraser's Hill and it flows westwards to an estuary at Minangtang. It presents a significant anti-tank obstacle due to its consistent width of at least 200 yards, which is going to be key in this, as Yamashita's proved he's quite armor heavy. However, insufficient troop numbers prevented complete coverage of the river's length. Consequently, the decision was made to stage the next delaying action at a narrow point about 9 miles north of the Slim River. That's at the village of Trolloc. And I actually have a cute little map over here. You can see to the right-hand side, it has a little separate section that shows Trolloc. And this is going to be quintessentially called the Battle of Slim River. It's actually a few small battles all put together. However, excuse me. So the village of Trolloc was situated just north of the river, you can see there, while the market town of Tejong Malim lay about 10 miles to the south. Now, Paris established his 11th Indian Division's headquarters at Tejong Malim. A rail bridge spanned the Slim River, and Paris planned to defend a bottleneck north of the river using 3 brigades. One of these is Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart's 12th Brigade. I'm not sure, Gaurav, did you have anything to say about Ian Stewart? You are muted.
Okay, this is so common with me at work.
Yeah, I know.
But when I said I was alluding to British army culture,
Yeah.
what was prevalent before the war, this is where I was really going to bring it up.
Okay.
So, Colonel Ian Stewart, he was commissioned into the army just before World War One even broke out, so 1913. And he fought with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders in Feb 14 and became the first British soldier on 11th August be to land in France during World War One. So it's quite a distinction, right, to be the first of
Yeah.
considering couple of million of them would be there.
Yeah. Well, that's, yeah.
And he was also mentioned in a dispatch. And he twice earned the Military Cross, as it was a Military Cross and Bar for service in World War One. So a really brave officer. But he never really got to advance that much because his final rank was a temporary captain. Even during the war. Granted, like in the war with the expansion, a lot of guys went up. Like people like Harold Alexander was acting lieutenant colonel. And between the wars, he was, on half pay, but restored to full rank of captain by 1925. 1931, he's promoted to a major. And he still continues to serve with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. And he was like very much in love with this particular unit. It's like that unit loyalty is really going to shine with this guy because he's going to command them only. And he even would actually he refused the position of a staff posting, which is considered in the armies at this time for advancement in career, so that he could stay in command of the 2nd Battalion of this regiment. So that's some serious love, man.
Yeah.
And at the outbreak of the war, he was they were stationed in India, and he was one of the officers that said if we go to war at the outbreak of Second World War, so this is still a couple of years before they entangle with Japan. He's one of the few officers that's really suggesting that if we need to fight the Japanese, we need to train and excel at jungle warfare. To the British Army, this is ludicrous. Why is he even saying that? We have tanks, we have guns. they have the iron not steel, like, sorry, the steel not flesh policy, which when we have our favorite field marshal coming up, that's where I'll elaborate a bit more. So if we are going to mechanize our army and have like all these powerful equipment, why does the infantry and jungle fighting even matter? And British officers, for the early part of the war, they still were transitioning from that, I call it like a lazy club officer's outlook to a proper military outlook. British officers during the interwar years, they when they met in the mess or anything, they never seem to want to talk about how they can improve the unit's cohesion, what could be some innovative tactics that will come into play, etc. There were even still cavalry officers who, even in the mid 1930s, Britain resisted tanks. And so, in comparison, you have an officer here who's insisting on training for jungle warfare for a future war. It must have been absolutely ridiculous to most of the officers. And in early 1941, he's transferred to Malaysia with his battalion, and most people call him a crank, just because he's not getting along with the other officers for his insistence on preparing for jungle warfare. And he rigorously trains his battalion for the next few months in the climate of Malaysia, getting them used to moving, navigating, and surviving in the jungle. We alluded to how badly the British were getting routed in the previous two episodes. This, along with the 12th Brigade, are examples of some units that are able to fight effectively because their officers insisted on training and leading them well. So that, and his was one of the effective units that they would be inflicting pretty brutal punishment on the Japanese every time they encountered them, because these guys knew how to operate in the jungle. And this is something the British are not even going to adapt, the concept of jungle warfare, until he returns in 1942 to India. And by the time you have changes of command in British India. And he does get the command of the 12th Infantry Brigade in late 1941. And he would continue serving in the Battle of Malaysia and Singapore. I'll just leave it at that because we will be covering some of his unit's actions late in the upcoming two episodes.
All right, I'm going to bring back up my map of the Battle of Slim River. So, as Gaurav said, Lieutenant Colonel Ian Stewart's 12th Brigade was positioned at the forefront, and it was quite constricted. It was a green area near Trolloc. The depleted 28th Brigade was placed to cover the road and railway on the river's northern bank. The 15th Brigade was assigned to cover the rear in Tanjung Malim. This arrangement represented a defense in depth strategy. Stewart strategically deployed his three battalions, one directly on the narrow front and another in support. However, the commanding officer of the 4th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Wilson Haffenden, was wounded in an air attack shortly after assuming his position. Haffenden was among a growing number of casualties resulting from constant daytime attacks by Japanese fighters and light bombers. The Japanese pilots exploited the predictable concentration of defenders along the narrow road, attacking with relative impunity due to limited anti-aircraft defenses beyond, the shoulder-held Bren guns that they had. So you have to imagine, as these men are running down the coastal roads of Malaya, there's really nowhere else they can possibly be, because in other words, you're running through rubber plantations, thick jungle, could be rice paddies and swamplands. So it was really easy for the Japanese to pick them off, and they were doing this 24/7. So these British soldiers are being harassed to the extreme limit. The 4 Battalion's primary role was to serve as a tripwire, alerting the rest of the brigade of large-scale attacks and, to try and delay the Japanese advance. A significant issue was the inadequate deployment of available artillery, attributed to the belief that the terrain hindered effective lines of sight. Only about 8 artillery pieces capable of firing 25-pound shells were set up, while over 16 others were kept further back for safer transport across the river during a potential withdrawal. So it's kind of defeatist if you think about it. They're already positioning their artillery to get
Eight
out of there,
eight guns is nothing, especially in World War II standards.
especially
Hell,
when you have 16 others. Yeah, it's pretty crazy.
uh, even Napoleonic era, even but like a corps would be having 30 cannons. At that time, artillery was not even as prevalent.
Yep. It just goes to show the defeatist mentality that already kind of entrenched itself in the men. And the 25 pounder shells, which were effective against German tanks, in World War II, could have been highly valuable to these frontline troops. It would have made Swiss cheese of any of the Japanese tanks that would have been hit by them, for example. Furthermore, the four battalions' defenses were poorly constructed. They lacked mines, anti-tank guns, despite their availability. Again, they
Just
keep
one
moving
thing I was
things.
just
Yeah.
adding, the British still, at this point of the war, across all theaters, haven't realized that the greatest tank killers are not tanks.
Yeah,
They
it's the
still hold that
anti-tank gun.
belief.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is
And
very
then,
early.
and
Yeah.
then, still, but they would have learned it they still did not even learn this in North Africa by now, considering we are in,
Mhm.
Rommel's already given them quite a few bloody noses.
Yeah, that's very true. The battalion behind them possessed anti-tank guns, mines, and barbed wire. So yeah, the frontline guys were basically out there with their hands, in their pants, basically. By this point in the campaign, there was also a huge shortage of boys' anti-tank rifles. It's kind of a staple of the British Army this time. Less than a day before the main assault, he received some information suggesting that there was going to be a major armored attack. A Tamil laborer reported seeing at least 80 tanks in a nearby village. However, his description of the vehicles as having wheels on them led the British officers to dismiss the report, assuming that he was, mistaking trucks for tanks, as tanks have visible rows of sprockets and obviously not the classic wheels of a car. You can picture a tank in your head. That's what they were thinking. They thought the guy he misidentified it. He didn't. These were Japanese Type 95 tanks that had six bogie wheels on either side. Now, exhaustion from constant movement, fighting, aerial attacks, and limited time for defense construction further demoralized the troops, as you can imagine, who were underfed as well, unwashed, and they were sleep deprived. The Japanese, they would initiate probes along the railway line in the morning, but they were repelled by the artillery fire, leaving approximately 60 of them dead. The remainder of the day was relatively quiet. Stewart wanted to withdraw his exhausted men for 48 hours of rest and recuperation. Paris agreed to this, and he sent reinforcements from the Divisional Reserve to a position south of Trolloc Village. 90 minutes after the reinforcements arrived, that's when the Japanese launched their attack. Now, this is a night attack, and it's a night tank attack, which is a little uncommon for World War II, mind you. And this was, of course, under the command of Major Hajime Shimada. I'm not sure. Did you find anything on Hajime? He's only a major, so I would imagine you might not have.
Um, no, I struggled. At the most, I just found just the basic biography of his life, but nothing about his service history, unfortunately.
Nah, that's what happens. A lot of these battles that we're going to be talking about are lower ranking, like underneath colonel level, and you're not going to find too much information on these guys. But Shimada was commanding the Japanese force, which consisted of approximately 30 T-95 tanks and 10 two-man light tanks, along with trucks carrying infantry. This is a highly mobile force. Shimada convinced his superiors to allow his tanks to lead the initial night attack. Following some setbacks at Kampar, the commanders likely saw this as at least a worthwhile risk because they did take quite a licking last time. Shimada was aware of the danger of advancing on such a narrow front, where artillery could easily devastate his force. By about
Oh, the
yeah.
artillery that is very undergunned.
The only thing that the British had an advantage of in the entire campaign was better artillery. And here they are trying to basically get it across the river to run away. Anyways, by 3 a.m. on January the 7th, heavy rain was falling. The defenders were positioned in foxholes along the jungle road north of Trolloc village. At dusk, they heard some gunfire, suggesting the Japanese were trying to pinpoint their positions. At 3:30 a.m., the Japanese began firing their mortars and artillery shells. About 15 minutes later, Japanese infantry were within 300 yards of the four defenders, attempting to breach barbed wire and other obstacles. At 4 a.m., the tanks arrived and their machine guns began, firing everywhere, so you'd be seeing like a lot of yellow tracers. Their forward anti-tank guns remained silent, as their crews were possibly dead or they already fled. The tracer rounds caused widespread panic amongst the defenders, who all began to retreat. This caused a rout, which would continue till about 4:30 a.m. when one of Shimada's T-95s detonated an anti-tank mine. The tank behind it was then disabled by a boy's anti-tank rifle. Punjab defenders, positioned on the high ground just near that area, began using Molotov cocktails against the tanks, which is, another thing that's not talked about too much. This is really prominent in the Eastern Front, and of course, the most common in the Winter Wars between the Finns and the Soviets. The
The
Molotov
boys
cocktail,
anti-tank.
oh, it's the
Oh,
Molotov cocktail. The
true.
Molotov cocktail, as primitive a weapon as you could think, against certain tanks, depending on how their exhausts work, because older tanks in World War II, some of them had these back ports that you could literally just throw an incendiary into. And I mean quite easily. As a human being, you could run behind the tank and do this. And this is how the Finns actually took down a lot of the old Soviet tanks. And over here, I'd imagine they I don't really know if the Type 95 has this exact. I would imagine it has a default like that too. So they're probably making good use of that. If not, throwing Molotov cocktails, enough of them on a tank will cause it to become quite cooked up. So it's a good way when you don't seem to have enough armor penetration to take these bad boys down. So Shibata's
I
plan is
think
clear. Oh yeah, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add just the size, the boys anti-tank rifle. That's a big gun for a man to carry.
Oh yeah, well yeah, it's
So
two guy crews, right?
yeah, so for the audience, the overall length of the entire weapon, 5 feet 2 inches.
Yeah, that's a big weapon.
It's I actually like Googled some photos. You could see it's like the entire backpack of the Finnish soldiers because it was like the Molotov cocktail used quite heavily during the Russian-Finnish war,
Hmm.
and the skiers of the Finnish army would be having this, and it does pack quite a punch because any weapon any tank that had armor of up to about 24 millimeters, it can penetrate it.
Certainly for the
So it's
Japanese, most of their, I think the heaviest they got here is 22. I think maybe the Type 95 has 422, but yeah, the Japanese armor was very weak for their tanks. Yeah. Shimada's plan clearly backfired, and the Japanese were beginning to panic. His armored column was immobilized, and the defenders' artillery could now target them. Illuminated, of course, by the Molotov cocktail fires that were probably all over their tanks at this point. The Japanese responded by making noise to try and scare the enemy, and the tanks, which lacked radios, very crucial point of information, by the way, forced the commanders to open their hatches to try and shout orders, making them vulnerable to grenades and gunfire. Ironically, the Molotov cocktail fires revealed paths for the tanks to escape, and Shimada's force did manage to break free. The opportunity to
I
destroy
think
the.
the
Oh, go ahead.
fact, sorry, one fact that Japanese tanks, like the Italians, and I think most of the French tanks also, radios
Yes.
or lack thereof.
Yeah,
It's
it's
it's quite
it's a
crazy, right? How people do. I think they all underestimate the power of communication between units, because that's literally how Germany won the Battle of France with its tanks. Even though their tanks were outnumbered and outgunned by the Allied tanks.
by like yeah, by a lot too. Yeah, no, the Japanese definitely did not exploit, which was something that they had pioneered, by the way. Radio technology was something in the Russo-Japanese War that they were one of the first to actually try and build their own sets and stuff. So it is kind of sad that they didn't have the forethought to make this a significant issue. Of course, they had the technology, but at this moment, they just weren't using it. The opportunity to destroy the entire column was lost, possibly due to the failure of the newly arrived reinforcements not having established their telephone lines to direct their artillery fire. So it's a pretty unlucky, really unlucky. The Japanese came right at the time they were shifting their units, and that's pretty much what screwed it up for the Allies. By 6 a.m., most of the Japanese tanks had moved on, mopping up the infantry. However, the leading tanks were halted again by another anti-tank mine. Molotov cocktails were used again, and the 12th Brigade engaged with two anti-tank guns. One tank was destroyed, but the guns soon fell silent, possibly due to gun crews being unnerved by the advancing Japanese infantry. By about 7 a.m., organized resistance collapsed and the defenders began to flee the Trolloc area. Now, in the central sector, defenders witnessed the fleeing soldiers. Captain Kenneth McLeod recalled this, and here it is. It is a quote. Turbaned soldiers ducked around me and under my arms and stood there like a traffic officer to whom no one pays any attention. Interesting quote. It became clear that they were fleeing a tank attack. Roadblocks were hastily set up as commanders attempted to prepare charges to destroy the Trolloc Bridge. The first four tanks appeared, exploiting the remaining darkness. The tanks easily overcame the initial roadblock, but the second line of defense, including armored cars and boys' anti-tank rifles. One tank was set ablaze by a Molotov cocktail and immobilized by a shot from a boy's rifle. The armored cars were hit by tank shells and they were disabled. The defenders heroically tried to push the damaged armored cars to the southern end of the Trolloc Bridge to try and delay the Japanese advance before they would blow it up. The bridge was destroyed around 6:30. However, many Japanese forces bypassed the sector, attempting to encircle the fleeing defenders before they could reach the Slim River position. The Japanese launched ambush attacks with their tanks along the roadways, forcing many defenders to seek refuge in the jungles. Second Lieutenant Ian Primrose was knocked unconscious during one of these ambushes. Upon regaining consciousness, he discovered the Japanese were taking prisoners and segregating the wounded. Primrose said that he and other British walked wounded as they heard gunshots and realized what was happening with mounting horror. He recalled this moment, and this is another quote. Everybody had heard the stories about Japanese atrocities in China, but that was Asians dealing with Asians. We never expected this sort of thing to happen to us. So, for the audience, if you haven't figured it out, the Japanese were basically they were shooting the wounded POWs, so they didn't have to deal with them. And yeah, that's
Well,
the
sometimes we've seen it in so many wars where whether through fear or just brutality or logistical considerations, they kill the POWs or surrendered soldiers.
Yeah, because from the Japanese point of view, this is a lightning strike going down Malaya. They are trying to go as quickly as they can to cut off as many men before they reach Singapore. So, yeah, they're not taking prisoners. At least not
And
prisoners that are wounded.
yeah, and you also have to pull back some of your forces to guard them.
Yeah.
And it's also a logistical strain.
Yeah, of course. Afterwards, the surviving prisoners were forced to dig graves for the men that were murdered, and they would carry the wounded Japanese soldiers as they continued. So you can imagine swallowing that pill. Primrose had to carry a Japanese officer he had shot twice. The man died before he could reveal his assailant, however. The column of tanks, trucks, infantry, and prisoners were marching their way towards the Slim
That is
River.
very good for that lieutenant.
Oh yeah, he would have been killed. Now, just en route south of Trolloc, reinforcements from Paris were approaching with ammunition and heavy weapons. Shimada's vanguard, led by Second Lieutenant Sadenobu Watanabe, who I'm sure you could not have found information on. Yeah, no, he's just a lieutenant.
I raise my
Yeah,
I raise my hands.
yeah. He was ambushed by approaching vehicles. The first two companies, approximately 250 men, were decimated. Watanabe, however, he pushed on. Near Slim River, Watanabe's tanks attacked a Gurkha's brigade. It was actually their headquarters area. And Captain Tom Mooney, instead of seeking cover, apparently he did this. This is another quote. He drew his .45 revolver, stood his ground, and fired upon the tanks until he was shot dead. It's a Hollywood moment, to be sure.
It doesn't it feel like General Maletti of the Italian Tenth Army when
Yeah,
Richard
it's actually,
O'Connor
yeah.
launched his attack?
Yeah, it's exactly like Milady.
He was, I think, at his tent in that fortress of where the Italians were camped, where the
Yeah, he was
Maletti
having
group was
breakfast.
camped.
They were all eating
Yeah, and then
breakfast at that
he
time.
and he runs out with a machine gun and gets machine gun.
Yep. Now, Watanabe's primary objective was to seize the Slim River Road Bridge. There he encountered another Gurkha force, many of whom were young recruits. Major Winkfield recalled this. It's a quote. True, the battle sounded a bit close, but we were miles behind the front, and there was no air about. The men behind were looking back and hurrying. They kept pressing forward. The next thing I knew, a machine gun blazed in my ear. A bullet grazed my leg and I dived into the ditch as a tank bore down on me. It had passed through half of my battalion without me realizing that anything was even amiss. To say the least, the death toll was quite high. Colonel Fulton was wounded and later he would die in captivity. Now, at his headquarters in Tanjong Malim, Archibald Paris was unaware of the rapid collapse of his brigades. 2 hours after the Japanese attack, intelligence ceased. Reports of enemy breakthroughs began to surface, though. Paris dispatched Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Harrison to investigate, and Harrison had this to recall. The next thing I knew was a deafening volley of machine gun bullets shattering my windscreen. I wrenched the wheel hard to starboard, crashed into the ditch, opened the door, leapt out, and ran like hell for over 50 yards of open ground to flimsy security of some scattered rubber. A man named Golem, who I think was his driver, showed up right behind him, holding a wounded shoulder, stating in bewilderment this quote, "Are those armored cars, Sahib?" Now, Watanabe was continuing his advance, where he killed Lieutenant Colonel Charles Home. So another man who was present there. Watanabe then reached the bridge defended by Beaufort's gunners and a Hong Kong artillery unit. Their anti-tank guns using airburst ammunition were ineffective against T-95 armor. The gunners were all fled, and Watanabe began cutting the wires to the demolition charges that were being set up on the bridge. Watanabe was injured himself, but he remained on the bridge, while Ensign Tochiro Seto led troops with 3 tanks south of the river towards Tanjong Malim. Seto killed Colonel Augustus Murdoch there. A Japanese soldier at the scene later said this: Seto died in an officer-like manner, with his hand on the hilt of his service sword. Our old friend who's evil as hell, Tsuji, who was also present in many of these battles, witnessed the wreck, and he had this to say. Seto had collapsed beside his gun like a dish of ame. Now, Harrison said of the entire experience running from the tanks in his unpublished history of the 11th Division that he could not conceal his admiration for the men who almost killed him and his sidekick, Mustaf Ghulam. I think it was his driver. I can't remember. These are old notes I had. He has another quote to say. Heedless of the danger of their isolation, they had shattered through the division, and they had captured Slim Bridge by the recklessness and gallant determination. Now, aside from this battle that's raging on at Slim River, we have another event. Someone is arriving to Singapore. So, Gaurav, I will allow you to talk about our dear old friend going back to, the desert campaign in North Africa, British General Sir Archibald Wavell.
I'm just gonna call out how you just told me go to town
Mm-hmm.
when on. So I think let's start with a little bit of background. Uh, General Wavell was a career officer. His the year he was commissioned into the British Army, 1901. So he was a decade plus experienced soldier when the First World War broke out. Fought pretty well in the Second Battle of Ypres, where he actually lost his left eye in combat. So I guess that's where we have the monocle look of General Wavell.
Yeah, of course.
It's kind of classy though. I'm not gonna lie. And he did continue with the 64th Highland Division and would even win uh, the Military Cross. And towards the end of the war, he was a staff as the assistant adjutant and quartermaster general of the Supreme War Council in Versailles, and would later be even promoted to the temporary rank of brigadier general. It's quite an advancement for Wavell. Now, between the wars, he is continuing to work in the army, but is on reduced rank and reduced pay, which was just a standard thing that happened. So he actually returned to a full rank of a lieutenant colonel. Could have been worse. We've seen people go down back to captain. And he continued to serve the War Office. And he was mostly involved in the Middle East area. And even at one point in the early 1930s, he was actually appointed as aide-de-camp to King George V, which he held for about 1.5 years and then was actually promoted to, it is a bit comical. he gets promoted to full rank of Major General, but they don't have enough jobs for Major Generals. He's gone back to, he has to relinquish command of his brigade, and he's unemployed again and on half pay. It's a bit comical in its own
Jeez.
way.
Yeah, that's pretty rough.
Yeah. Then he finally, while on half pay, gets command of the second division. And in the late 1930s, he gets transferred to Palestine as part of the British Middle Eastern Command. And he was the GOC, that is the General Officer Commanding of the British forces in Palestine and Transjordan. And he got promoted in January 1938 to the full rank of Lieutenant General. At least this time he would be keeping employment for a few years to come. Sorry,
Yes.
that.
But he is going to be going to multiple theaters, to say the least, getting pushed around quite a bit. And Garov? Did I just lose you?
Yeah, unfortunately my power just went off.
Sorry, you're
Just got
back.
back on hotspot.
Okay,
Yeah,
oh,
it
that
was
was
just my
quick.
power. No,
Not
it's still out. I just switched to the hotspot.
All right, so now we have.
Um, so just back to him. Where did you lose me? So in the build up to World War II, some interesting things I found out was he was quite anti. He was opposed to Zionism, completely opposed to it. He even said that the Balfour Declaration was a huge mistake.
Oof.
Yeah, and like many British army officers, he actually detested Neville Chamberlain for the rearmament policy.
Hmm.
So, despite Neville Chamberlain getting this rapport of being an appeaser, someone who would not take any military action, he, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, which was one of the political roles that he held, he was actually aggressively rearming Britain
Yeah.
without like bankrupting it. The problem is he gave first priority it to the Royal Air Force and then the Royal Navy, and then quoting what many army officers felt, they got the scraps.
It
So
is
you could see that's
understandable given Britain is an island nation, but yeah.
true. And they felt like they are being completely ridiculous for the fact that you're not going to win a war completely without an army,
Yeah, it's true.
just by air and sea. Then by April 1938, he's GOC Southern Command in UK. So it's quite a big step up. And in July 1939, just before the outbreak of war, he's made GOC of the army in the Middle East Command.
Psst. Hey you ever hear me talk about some great Pacific War movie or documentary like Pearl Harbor Minute by Minute over on Netflix and feel the urge to watch it for yourself?
Uh-oh, you live in Japan, and your Netflix doesn't have it? Must suck to be you.
Sucks to be me right now.
Oh wow, season 4 of Demon Slayer is out. Oh wait, I can't watch it on Canadian Netflix, but it's over on Japan Netflix? Whatever will I do?
Oh, no, no.
Being blocked from regional content? With private internet access, you too can watch Demon Slayer Season 4 by switching your IP address to Japan.
Yes! Hell yeah!
Why stop with Japan? With private internet access, you can change your IP address to over 84 different countries and every single US state, giving you access to region-restricted content all over the world.
Nice.
Many websites and services like Netflix are only accessible depending on your physical location, but private internet access helps you overcome these restrictions. Think about it. Without private internet access, it's like paying for a TV series and missing out on the latest season. Shots fired, Demon Slayer on Canadian Netflix.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Ever fear people are gonna find your Google searches?
Banzai! Banzai! Banzai!
FBI, open up!
Private internet access makes sure that those Google searches remain a buried secret, as private internet access encrypts your internet access and has a no logs policy. Think you're safe with the local coffee shop's free Wi-Fi? No, you are certainly not. Private internet access gives you more privacy features than any other software, and real-time protection from malware and trackers. giving you peace of mind knowing those Google searches remain seen by you and you alone. Private Internet Access has a no-log policy that they've defended in court, which means they are not storing any of your browsing data. Hey, are you like me using different devices under one household? Private Internet Access is available on all platforms and protects an unlimited amount of devices at the same time. I personally use Private Internet Access to unblock movies and TV series from all across the globe, and I sleep easier writing scripts for my YouTube channel and others knowing my data is secure. Look, this is a no-brainer. Sign up with my link in the description of this video to get 83% off, plus 4 months for free, so it ends up being only around $2 per month. Signing up for Private Internet Access is risk-free. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, and 24/7 customer support is available. So don't forget to click www.piavpn.com/the Pacific War Channel, and a big thanks to Private Internet Access for sponsoring this video.
And this is where the problems start, because by early 1940, it's not only Middle East, he has to be considering East Africa, Greece, and the Balkans along with the Middle East. It's a huge area of operations that this guy had to deal with over 40 languages being spoken by the natives within his command. So it's quite a difficult time. And when Italy entered the war in June 1940, he knew that he would have to prepare for war. He did work quite well with Anthony Eden, who was a key member of Churchill's political cabinet. And this is quite important. Churchill hated Wavell from the get-go because Wavell was a quiet, shy, reserved man. And he just speaks very laconic. And Churchill took that for defeatism. He was not a defeatist. He just did not have much to say, and Churchill just did not like him. Though I don't think Wavell also had a really good opinion of Churchill. But it was actually thanks to Anthony Eden that in 1940, he still kept the job because Churchill was hell-bent on sacking him.
Yeah.
But Eden and the war cabinet just said, because the proposed replacement does not have any experience that Wavell has. And he starts getting the Australian, New Zealand, and Indian troops. And so he does help with the launching of Operation Crusader with General Richard O'Connor. And, that we have covered quite extensively in our North Africa podcast. So folks, go give a listen to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite good. And at the same time, there is unrest in Palestine, which he has to also hold back forces. Now, another interesting aspect is he deliberately held back a lot of British troops in Egypt itself. And that is because even though Egypt was allied with the British, he did not trust the king of, the emperor, who was very anti-British. Though he can't, the King Farouk of Egypt, because Wavell thought he would actually join the Allies given his, the anti-British sentiments that he put out quite openly. And this is where and then with Churchill promising to send aid to Greece, he has to divert forces from Libya to Greece. Which is why he would take heavy casualties there in the subsequent battles of Greece and Crete. One thing is Wavell knew how to train soldiers. So this is where a lot of disagreement would happen between Churchill and him, is Churchill will just be looking at a piece of paper in the War Office in London. He'll say, okay, this guy has 10 divisions under his command. That's a lot of soldiers. 200, 300,000 men. Why is he not doing anything? He did not seem to consider that a lot of the times the equipment and men had to be trained specifically for months when they arrived in Cairo to be combat operational capable in the Middle East, or some of the divisions that were earmarked to help in Ethiopia and North Africa, or the forces that he lost in the Greece venture, which most of the general staff were kind of actually opposed to. So that was a big blow to him. So Wavell is dealing with the reality of his forces. Churchill just thinks that this guy is dithering, and he would be replaced by General Auchinleck, who was actually the commander in India at that time. Because when Iraq kind of went into a pro-Axis regime, Churchill wanted to secure it because at least with the oil fields here, the British in the Middle East have their oil requirements completely taken care of. It's one less logistical headache. Wavell couldn't said he had no forces to spare, which was actually true. And the AUK immediately offered, I think, about 2-3 brigades of infantry, plus an additional division could be bought in like after a couple of weeks or so. And to Churchill, this was like, oh yeah, this is that bombastic guy. He's aggressive. He will go and get me the results. And given how Churchill was prioritizing the war in Europe, he had them switch commands towards the end of 19.
Oh, I think I might have lost you again, Gaurav.
The only guy that hated Wavell.
Oh, okay, you're back.
Almost yeah. Sorry. Where did you lose me?
Sorry, yeah, no, it's just it cut out for like two seconds there.
I think this is just a Zoom issue.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
as I was saying, Churchill never rated Wavell highly, and he's probably the only person who did not. Kind of like Wingate not rating the Gurkhas.
Yeah, true.
Rommel respected him quite a bit. Anthony Eden and a lot of the politicians also regarded Wavell quite well. They said, it just takes a little bit of time to know him, and then he's a very good commander. Though in Churchill's view, he's nothing more than a colonel. He's not worth more.
Oh, right.
And just one thing I'll just say. When Auchinleck took over in North Africa, he wrote, in no sense do I wish to infer that I found an unsatisfactory situation on my arrival. Far from it. Not only was I greatly impressed by the solid foundations laid by my predecessor, but I was also able to better appreciate the vastness of problems with which he had been confronted and the greatness of his achievements. In a command in which some 40 languages are spoken by the British and Allied forces. You kind of really have to give Wavell his dues. I know we mock him a bit, and he's not immune to criticism. I don't think he was aggressive enough, but I don't think the politicians back home completely understood the scale of his problems.
No, certainly not in hindsight. But Wavell is basically, he's touching down in Singapore on January the 7th, just as Paris's men are being completely overrun, and Wavell assumes control over the British Far Eastern Command. He's beginning to get reports of the 11th Division's misfortunes, and he travels to Rasa, where he discovers Brigadiers Stewart and Selby, and then he recalled this. I have never seen two men look so tired. By the end of the day, Stewart's 12th Brigade could only muster up about 430 officers and men, and about a sixth of its strength, only around 200 armed men in all. For Selby's 28th Brigade, they're a bit better off at about 750. Wavell was shocked, and he thought this was serious errors, he thought serious errors had been made, and this was his first indication that Percival should probably not be in command of this. Now, 48 hours before the Japanese arrived at the Slim River Road Bridge, Percival had already decided to abandon Central Malaya. Wavell quickly realized that Johor was going to be the vital grounds to be defended, and that they needed to gain enough time for the arrival of the reinforcements there. So he appointed the... Oh,
Greg,
yeah?
could you maybe switch to the larger map?
Oh, yeah, sure. Here, I'm going to actually decrease it. Can you see all the way down to Johor Banu?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. It kind of gives you an idea of where they're moving. Now, he appointed the 8th Australian Division to defend northwestern Johor, while the Indian forces were placed in defense of the southern and northeastern parts of Johor. the British were facing a very dire situation. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Harrison, despite being on the receiving end of the Japanese advance, admitted in his unpublished history of the 11th Division this quote: "Could not conceal I could not conceal my admiration for the men who had almost killed me." And I'm realizing this is the same quote that I had given before. So I apologize to the audience. I did not look over my notes and
I
see
was just
this.
about to say.
Yeah. Um, Actually, I have another quote here, though, from Lieutenant Colonel Stewart, who later reflected on the battle, stating, "I am rightly criticized for the location of the brigade headquarters and for not using the field artillery in an anti-tank role. It is no excuse, but I had never taken part in an exercise embodying a coordinated anti-tank defense of this type of attack. The use of tanks on a road at night was quite a surprise for me." So, the loss at
It's kind of
Slim,
true though.
yeah,
But even on the Western Front, Eastern Front, very few night tank attacks ever took place.
yeah, this is pretty new to the British. Of course, the Japanese specifically trained for night fighting, and this would include armored attacks,
And
naval
I
attacks. Yeah,
I think I'll just say this much, especially as Colonel Stewart was a big advocate for jungle fighting.
Mhm.
Uh, this is spoiler, like when he retreats after this entire campaign, he returns to India, and I think by the time he's, taking operational duties, General Auchinleck is back as GOC for British India, and Wavell has been promoted to Viceroy.
Promoted is strong words, but yeah, he's
That's
been
actually what
demoted up. Yeah.
yeah, that's actually the thing. You in these militaries, you have guys who don't like each other, so to remove him from power, you promote him.
There
That
was a specific saying Churchill would kick him up the stairs. I think that's what they used to call it.
it's even in World War One. I could just give this quick example. General Joffre hated Petain when he was an army commander,
Yeah, of course.
so he promoted him to group command, so that Petain could not be directly influencing the battle. Then this was during Verdun,
Yeah.
and one of Joffre's favorite guys, General Newell, took over.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that's what the French government would do to Joffre to remove him from the CNC role as well.
Yeah. Uh,
But so just I digress. So back to Stewart, when he would be one of the key figures giving recommendations to Auchinleck and Wavell and General Slim on how to reorganize and train the British Army for jungle warfare, since he was one of the leading British pioneers of that concept. He never would emphasize the role of artillery as the primary arm. He always would be the infantry first guy, which makes sense for jungle warfare since movement could be very restricted for tanks and armored vehicles, or air cover will be minimal. So I wouldn't hold that statement that he put about not using the artillery too much against him, since it's not artillery and tanks are not the kings of jungle warfare. It's a foot soldier.
yeah, that's true. Obviously, the loss at Slim River included the loss of a lot of 25-pounder artillery pieces, which is egregious since it's kind of the only thing that is benefiting the British at this point. And even before the Slim River defeat, Percival had decided to abandon Central Malaya, which is incredibly defeatist, mind you, which also allowed Yamashita to exploit road networks on the western coast. Percival planned to retreat about 140 miles, abandoning numerous key locations, and a new defensive line was going to be established in northern Johor, reinforced by the incoming East Anglican Territorials. Now, this is bringing us up to General Bennett. By any chance, did you find anything on Bennett?
Oh yeah, just checking if I was on mute. Yeah, he was a decorated soldier of the Anzacs. So he, like many of the senior officers, saw action, and his first piece of action in World War One, Gallipoli. So he
That
went through.
sucks. Yeah,
But
God.
to be fair, if you were in, and he was part of the first division, and he landed on Anzac Cove on 25th April 1915, and he led his battalion quite well, was wounded in action during the campaign, and he kind of got lucky because he was forced to be evacuated due to his injury. Because when the Turkish forces counterattacked, the 6th Battalion, so not the unit he was, the battalion level he was a part of, that force was isolated. Sorry, he was appointed the second commander of the 6th Battalion. The men he took to the ridge during the landings at Anzac before his injury forced him to be evac. Those men were completely isolated, surrounded, and killed to the man, including his younger brother.
Jeez. Oh my God. Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah. And he actually was in a medical ship at that time. And he immediately kind of like returned to the front lines. So he would continue to serve throughout the entire campaign. And then later he spends Christmas in Southampton and returns to Egypt. And then later his division would be moved to France, as you would have the future Australian Corps getting formed by 1916. So he would continue to serve in the Western Theater, and he commanded a brigade on the Western Front, leading them at battles of Boycott, Main Road, and Passchendaele in 1917. So did have some experience. He, unlike many other senior officers, he did not really have a full military life during the interwar period. He lived in Canterbury, and he actually was terminated from the AIF, the Australian Imperial Force. So that's the professional army of the Australians. He purchased a textile factory, and also he worked as a accountant and clothing manufacturer in New South Wales, Australia. But he did continue to serve in the militia. And, he was the commander of the 9th Infantry Brigade of the Australian Militia. And when World War II broke out, even though he was 52, he was actually passed over for promotion by Thomas Blamey.
Oh boy. There's another name.
Yeah. And it seems that the chief of the general staff, General Brundle White, actually opposed him because his temperament. So he was supposed to be a pretty aggressive guy, lacking the diplomatic tact, which actually I can see why you would pass over a guy at such a position for,
Makes
command.
sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
So he was given the command of the Volunteer Defence Corps, basically Australia's home guard.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And he would continue, and then he gets sent to Singapore in December. And he was going to be in command of what is going to be called West Force. And I don't know I think this is probably something that I do want to bring up in episode 5, but his aftermath of the campaign is quite a point of contention to this day.
Yes, it is. That's General Bennett, who's going to be commanding the 8th Australian Division at this time on the eastern coast. And he was pretty frustrated by the plan. Wavell, the new Supreme Commander, intervened, agreeing that Percival's decision to pull back to Johor was not great, but insisted, as Bennett put it, that the Australians were going to, quote, going into bat. We must take certain risks on the east coast temporarily in order to organize a good defense on the western side, which is immediately threatened. Wavell overruled Percival, and he moved Bennett's forces to the west coast of Johor, and this forms West Force, as you had mentioned. Now, we're going to be talking about something known as the Battle of Guimas, and unfortunately, there doesn't exist any decent maps of this, so I'm going to keep this one up for now. But the Battle of Guimas is actually part of a larger battle that we'll get into, and there is a larger map for that, so bear with me for a moment, YouTube audience. West Force was tasked with slowing the Japanese advance to allow Indian forces time to regroup. They dug in on the south bank of the Maar River, At this point, I actually want to bring up this map, which is kind of cute, by the way. It's from an author I really like, Francis Pike, notably from his book Hirohito's War. It's a very good
It's
book.
yeah, it's quite detailed actually.
Yeah, it's cute, and I guess it's designed in such a way to try and emphasize the actual territory. So like where the tree lines would be, where the water is, and all that, because we kind of need to think about this. It's a very restrictive area for fighting. Obviously, that's why they chose it for defense. And this is on the south bank of the Mar River. The British employed scorched earth tactics during this retreat, which Percival acknowledged caused British prestige to sink, remarking this. Pillars of smoke and flame rose into the sky as rubber factories, mine machinery, petrol, and oil stocks were denied. Small wonder that British prestige sank to a very low ebb amongst the population. They set up booby traps, which was a classic thing to do at this time, causing casualties to the Japanese. By the way, the Australians were very good at booby traps. Something that they were they were notably good at doing that in New Guinea. But I digress.
I'm just remembering the fact that the American and Canadians in the Aleutians campaign
Oh
launched an
God,
invasion
yeah,
of that
Kiska.
island,
Hmm.
Kiska, right?
It was
I'm getting
Kiska,
confused
yeah.
and they suffer 300 dead or something for no Japanese presence.
Yeah, I mean, the fatalities weren't that much. It was wounded, and I will bring this up because this is a big thing on YouTube. There were a lot of YouTubers. I don't want to point out names. I think simplified history, but they made videos that perpetuated this myth that like American forces and Canadian forces shot at each other and accidentally like there was a lot of fatalities. This really didn't happen. It was just booby traps. So they got on the
I
island.
think it was about 300, 400
Yeah,
casualties in
It's
total,
about-
right?
And by the way, those casualties, it's mostly, again, it's frostbite because they didn't have proper footwear, and it was the Americans, mind you. The Canadians actually had proper footwear. But what's so tragic, I shouldn't go into this because it's like a sidetrack, but what's so tragic about that event is the Canadians, we do not have the same military structure as the Americans. Like we're built off the British model, but we were forced to adapt to not just the American structure, but we had to use American equipment for our weaponry in that battle because they wanted to have the same ammunition and stuff just to be standardized. So the Canadian forces went out of their way to train for this operation to go on an island that was abandoned. Like it's so. Anyways, in the great scheme of things, it's a good thing that it was abandoned because, as anyone knows, if you haven't seen my episode in the Battle of that too, it's one of the most brutal battles of the Pacific War, and like no one talks about it. Really, it
Oh yeah,
was.
I'm
Horrifying.
completely with you. I've seen your video on it.
Yeah,
It's quite intense for both sides.
it's criminal because it's complete. Like no one ever thinks, oh yeah, there was this battle in World War II in the thick of like brutal winter on this godforsaken island in the middle of nowhere, where the Japanese and Americans they gave each other hell. And the ending is like hundreds of Japanese just banzai charging into their death. It's crazy, that one. I desist. The Japanese Fifth Army was advancing towards Gimas, near the Gamansa River Bridge. And here, Captain Jack Duffy would blow up the bridge, initiating a ambush by the 8th Australian Division.
If he was Captain Jack Sparrow, that would have been the greatest thing ever.
Well, we're gonna have a we're gonna have a Black Jack captain soon, so there's close. Duffy was astonished by what had happened, and he has this quote: "Japanese bodies, bicycles, timber, rocks, and earth flew far and wide in huge red flashes, leaving a gaping space where the bridge had been." The ambush resulted in quite heavy Japanese casualties, and one Lieutenant Colonel Frederick Black Jack Galligan. By the way, he is kind of a famous figure that comes about in this. He's a lower ranked guy, but he has kind of quite a big story afterwards. Well, he led his battalion to hold back the Japanese. Sergeant Kenneth Harrison, commanding a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, described the action as such. "These burst on contact, and the flash enabled me to see where we were hitting and to adjust the sights accordingly. With both guns pounding away at it, the second tank did not return our fire for long, but try as we might, we could not set it on fire. Eventually, our infantry sent a message: 'Tank destroyed, save ammunition.' It was difficult to tell how badly it was damaged because of the smoke and flame from the other one." Later on, he would add this: "It lay there with men crawling out like wood bugs from a burning log." We waved back rather lamely, but that without a doubt, the proudest moment either of us will ever know was then. After about 24 hours and inflicting heavy casualties, Galligan withdrew. Our friend Tsuji would write of the battle against the Australians this quote: "They fought with bravery we had not previously seen," which is notable
I think
because,
that's
yeah,
one
oh,
thing
yeah,
is Aussies and Japs in jungle warfare.
yeah, they're
Oh
crazy.
God, that's I know this is one example. I remember reading in the Coconut Trail campaign, one AIF soldier was found dead
Yeah,
with
yeah, that
30
was fun.
Japanese corpses around him, and I think two or three of the Japanese corpses, their skulls were fractured because he used the butt of the gun as a club,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, it was nuts. And by the way, for the audience, uh, Tsuji Masanobu, evil little officer who's going to be responsible for a lot of war crimes. He was a racist. He really didn't like the British. So for him to write something like that actually says a lot. He was impressed. Reinforcements arrived in Singapore, including the 53rd Infantry Brigade. There was a growing sense that the tide might be turning. Meanwhile, south of Gamas, in Moir, Horatio Duncan's 45th Brigade. I'm not sure, did you find anything on Horatio?
Horatio Nelson, yes.
Oh, okay. Do tell us.
I'm still trying to. No, Horatio Nelson.
Of course. Yes. Classic, yeah.
No, but I'm still trying to compile my notes since he's our big figure for the upcoming couple of
Oh, okay.
episodes. So,
We'll keep
sorry,
it for
my
the
bad. I
next
should
one.
have. Yeah.
Keep it for the next one. So Horatio's 45th Brigade was going to face Nishimura Kanoe's Imperial Guards Division, who, I'll just say it here. People think of like the imperial divisions of most of these militaries are the cream of the crop. And it is true that this group was chosen from like the tallest and best looking Japanese, but they were also kind of known as to be like we would back in World War One, you call them chocolate soldiers, basically. So they were on paper, they looked like tough, but they weren't by any
So they're
means
the
like
Roman
elites.
Praetorian Guards.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And like the other
They're
Japanese
not.
divisions would make fun of them. So yeah.
It's kind of like because anytime someone talks to me about Guards divisions, Guards regiments, and then you go back to the Napoleonic time era, like the French Imperial Guard, the Russian Imperial Guard back then, those were the actual best. And I know they got a lot of they frustrated their commanders frustrated these.
Oh, I think we lost Gareth again. So I will just continue what we were saying. So Horatio Duncan's
Yeah.
45th Brigade is facing Nishimura Kanoe's Imperial Guards Division, and it was going to be an uneven fight to say the least. By January the 16th, Mar had fallen. Lieutenant Colonel John Williams was leading one of the Jat battalions, consisting mainly of teenage Jats as part of a Mar River deployment, as they were making their way towards Bakri. Actually, at this point, do I have another map? Yeah, so this kind of shows if you look to the left, the direction of Mar, and this enters the Bakri area. Again, if you're not watching on YouTube, you kind of miss out on these maps. It's a little easier to
So
follow.
the retreat, so they're moving towards the east. If you were to look at this map,
Yeah. His force's position had been in a remote part upstream, and the Japanese had bypassed them as a result. They would be caught, and Williams was then beheaded by a Japanese officer using a katana. Williams was, I think he was a lieutenant in this area. On January the 17th, a tank attack on Bakri was repelled. More Australian reinforcements arrived, led by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Anderson. There was a determination to hold what was becoming the Mar Bakri front. As the 45th Brigade began their retreat, Percival learned that the Imperial Guards Division was the primary force in the Mar area. Percival then dispatched Anderson's 19th to try and hold the door open. The newly arrived 53rd Brigade was immediately sent into action, and one of Anderson's officers who stayed behind to help the Norfolks said this of the event. They were a fine body of men, but almost dazed by the position in which they found themselves. The CEO of the Norfolks was overheard telling his second in command this: "Your first job is to get the officers' mess going." This is while the
I
Australians
think
are.
I think this is alluding to what I was talking earlier about the army culture of Britain
Yeah.
still kind of being to the pre-war doctrine of not talking military stuff when off duty.
Yeah, and basically, this is being overheard by the Australians who are trying to put on like a straight face, hearing this kind of shit. Now at Bravery, Duncan's HQ was attacked from the air, and Lieutenant Ben Hackney, who was there, had this quote. Just beside the road, a naked waist with two twisted legs lay about 2 yards from a scarred bleeding head, with a neck, half a chest, and one arm. So it's a gruesome account of somebody.
Oh,
Another guy around there named who was a gunner named Russell Brandon recalled this. Okay, this is a hell of a quote. The black bastard was dead. Our best soldier had not survived, and we were now surrounded. That's a colorful quote there. The Imperial Guards were attacking Bakri from multiple directions at this point. The situation in Malaya was critical, to say the least. And that's going to
well,
be
I
what
mean, it's definitely critical considering they've been pushed down the entire country.
Yeah. I have one last map here. I'm going to just blow it up. That's actually going to be the conclusion of this episode, but just for everyone to kind of like take a note, the Mar, it doesn't show Gemas, but the Mar kind of Gemas area over there to the northwest. So they're breaking through now. They're breaking through Bakri, and they're basically on their way to what's going to become a new line in Johor. But I had
Maybe you
to,
could just go to the main map just to show it on the entire.
yeah. So
So I
all the
think
way
it's
in the
more,
south, yeah.
yeah.
So if
So the Britain has like what 10% of the country under its control for now.
yeah. So at the very beginning of this series, you can see here all the way north in Malaya and what is kind of Thailand. They kind of made landings. They made a few other landings. They did some hooks amphibiously, but not too much because they couldn't risk their boats. And basically, Yamashita's forces, more or less, they're just blazing through the western coastal roads, although there is movement on the eastern coastal roads as well. And yeah, it's going to come down to a stand in southern Malaya, and it's going to be in the area of Johor. Just
And this is,
before.
I think this is around 1 month of fighting, right? For the
Oh yeah,
Japanese.
even less. Yeah, it's crazy. This is a lightning fast campaign, and
And I think I'll just tell this just so that it's a bit contextual.
mhm.
I think the entire Malaysian portion of that peninsula is around 500 miles long.
Yeah, it's
So,
incredible.
so it's quite an advance in 1 month.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have to end it here because we're coming up to another critical point in the battles, and honestly, the episodes will get too long if I don't. But before I leave you, audience, if you'd like to further support the channel, please check out our YouTube membership or our Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast. You get early access to all of the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Until next time, Gaurav, thank you for joining us in this one. And yeah,
Looking forward to the next one already.
over
Thanks
and
for
out.
having me.